The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
Now today we're going to talk about three different Johns. We're going to talk first of all John of Kanty, then John of the Cross, then John of Capistrano. Certainly hope that the folks that are with us will not get confused when we talk about Johns, but let's talk first of all about John of Kanty. What do we know about him? Where is he from? When was he born and when did he die?
Well, he was born in the late 14th century and lived well into the 15th century. He was a priest of Poland, so we know the great affinity for the church in Poland given our late Holy Father, St. Pope John Paul II. But John of Kanty was a priest of Poland. He held a doctorate in theology, so he was well schooled and well educated in the teachings of the church. And this was very much a part of his life. Now, given that, initially as a priest and as a theologian, he wasn't very popular. So when you look at writings that say he was a doctor of theology, he understood this, he understood that, but he wasn't initially very popular, we can preclude that maybe he put the teachings more ahead of the people. And yet after a while, once they understood him, once they got used to him, his popularity really started to grow. People really did start to like him. And I'm sure it was a warming up of him, but him probably, if he was a smart man, as we know he was, understanding how to best use the information and the knowledge that he wanted to share with people.
And probably at the time, living to the age of 83 would have been probably unprecedented. So people looking at him at that age and celebrating his long life would have done so understanding that he has probably come a long way in his demeanor, in the way that he dealt with people. He may have mellowed with age. You know, oftentimes we talk about older people and more seasoned people getting better with age. We witness that in our own families, in our own experience. And so it tells us something about how one grows and matures in the Christian faith. And oftentimes it's hard to hold on to those things and beliefs that really ground us, and especially in the midst of criticism. And yet that did not stop John of Kanty to continue his mission and his ministry in the life of the church, but he probably found it a lot easier to do it. And the people found him a lot easier to take. We experience that in our own life, in our own relationships. Let's talk also about his beatification and canonization, which took place several years later. What are those dates?
Well, he was beatified in 1676, and interesting, we've talked about some saints who their canonization came very quickly. We've talked about some who it was hundreds of years. His was about 100 years, give or take, from his beatification to his canonization. One of the things that is noted about him, as I mentioned, he was a priest of Poland. He had the role of being a confessor. Now, we're used to the pattern of you can walk into a church, perhaps on a Saturday afternoon, you know, or maybe make arrangements later after Mass and have the priest hear your confession. At certain periods in the church, these were roles reserved for specific people. As a matter of fact, even though rarely used, there are some sins that a bishop might reserve the forgiveness of those sins only to himself. And so around the time of John of Kanty, most bishops were the confessors. You would journey to the bishop. During John's time, he is the only non-bishop to be a confessor. in his area, which tells us perhaps he was recognized by the people as someone whom they could have an affinity for. We know, again, with his degree and background in theology, he really fought against error or perceived error in the church. But we're also told that along his life, he started to combat it not with forcefulness, but with humor, with wisdom, with a certain sense of kindness and gentleness. And so if you take those qualities and put them on a confessor, isn't that what somebody would be looking for? Not someone who's going to beat them up, but someone who would use kindness and love and generosity. And so we see him kind of brought into that role even though he wasn't a bishop.
We know that historically in the life of the church, there were those priests in later years that were ordained specifically to be a confessor, because they may not have had a lot of educational background, they may not have been schooled in understanding theology, but yet they had this compassion, as you had mentioned. They had this being able to exude the forgiveness and reconciliation of Jesus. And so their whole mission in life in charism was really to be a confessor. Of course, we don't see that nowadays. You know, when a priest is ordained through the indults of the bishop, he's allowed to say Mass, he's allowed to hear confessions, he's allowed to celebrate the sacraments. So a priest does all of those things. But in his particular life, that is what he was known for. We've seen that in the lives of Padre Pio, for example, how people lined up to go to him for confession. We see that in the life of Brother Andre Basset, how he was such a compassionate person. So there's particular gifts that are given to people, not only the saints, but to each of us as well. And how important is it for us, we just have about 2 minutes left in this first segment, to understand and to celebrate the particular gifts that God has given each of us?
Well, I think if we want to connect with John Kanty, in particular, we talk about this sense of forgiveness and mercy and peace. And we all want or should want that from God, but we also have to allow that process to happen in our own lives with each other. I often think when we pray the Our Father, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. We're lying every time we say that. If you look at it in the interpretation of, I only want God to forgive me to the level with which I'm willing to forgive others. When we come before God and ask for forgiveness, there has to also be that challenge to go out and be a forgiving people. Very rarely can the priest put that restriction on absolution, but it should be something we desire, to go out and forgive as we are forgiven, to love as we are loved.
And I'd like to close this first segment by quoting John of Kanty, who once said, "Fight all error, but do it with good humor, patience, kindness, and love." Stay with us. We'll be right back.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her.
Instead of sitting on the couch, I hope to clean up.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I sent my husband a love email.
What have I done for my marriage today? It's a good question.
I gave her a call and say thinking of her and the kids.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
We're going to the museums as a family.
What have I done for my marriage today?
I made my wife coffee and breakfast this morning.
It's going to be her birthday next week, so I've been spending time today making arrangements to make that extra special.
Oh, we're spending the day together?
I bought her an orchid.
Hassan was able to let me sleep in by taking care of him in the morning.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. She's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Small changes can make a world of difference. Get started at foryourmarriage.org. A message from the Catholic Church.
I don't think like you. I don't laugh at the same jokes as you.
I don't speak like you.
I don't eat the food you do.
I don't celebrate the same holidays as you.
But I will help save your life.
When you help the American Red Cross, you help America.
Welcome back to our show. now about 75 years after the death of John of Kanty, we have John of the Cross. Let's talk a little bit about when he was born and where he was born and a little bit about his life.
Well, he was born in the mid-1500s in Spain. We see in the 16th, 17th century a whole different world than some of the saints that we've talked about in earlier days. We see a lot of growth, the Renaissance era. We see a lot of opening up in art and poetry and music, and also a great growth in the faith. We could say that these are some really strong times in the church, specifically in those very Catholic countries. And so we see in Spain, one of those very Catholic countries. We see it starts with the kings and queens themselves. It trickles down into the lives of all people, and certainly in the life of the religious.
And I think when we talk about the lives of religious, we're not talking about people of great means and great wealth. We're talking about communities that really struggle. And oftentimes religious communities, when they were founded, didn't always have a big benefactor to help them out. We see that in some regards to those people of means who founded communities, but many of them lived lives of poverty, lives of destitution. And so their poverty really, in a sense, was their wealth to begin their community and their order. We know that historically he was a contemporary and a friend of Teresa of Avila, also from Spain, a mystic, someone who understood very deeply the life of Christ and the presence of God within her. What do you think when those two saints get together that they celebrate, or the church celebrates, or we understand in their lives?
Well, one of the things that both of them are noted for is a certain sense of reformation of their order. And to go back a little bit about what you were talking about with the orders, we tend to, though religious communities are smaller and fewer in numbers of the types of communities that we have these days, we tend to, in our current age, we think of religious communities as those who taught or those who worked in hospitals, and so we've raised them up to these certain occupations. And as you mentioned, that wasn't always the case of all religious orders. Many of them are self-sufficient orders in terms of working the farm, tending the livestock. What can they sell from the land to continue to get by? And so we see this there was also room for everyone in a religious order too. It wasn't so much now, well, we're a teaching order, so you have to go to school to be a teacher, or we're a nursing order, so you have to go to school and become a nurse. You could have those who were in charge of the financial, those who were in charge of the land, those who tended the livestock. There was room for everybody to come together and offer their gifts. But there also was along the way, in different times, a need to reform. Sometimes they would lose sight of what they needed to really be about as a Christian community. Were they just a commune of people who came and lived together and shared common goals? Or were they truly always seeking this, being moved closer and closer in the life of Christ and bringing others along on the journey as well? And so we see in these two coming together, certainly Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, this sense of reform. They were both very much of a sense of that poverty, a sense of being impoverished for the Lord. They were certainly understanding of times of persecution in the church, but also both great writers and bringing an advancement of the faith for those to come.
Well, and I think that's significant that we should mention that John of the Cross was a prolific writer. And of course, Teresa of Avila is a doctor of the church. And so in her writings, people find encouragement, people find a deeper understanding of what the church is all about. We know we celebrate his feast in December 14th. We've often talked about those saints whose feasts are found in the Advent season. And so there's a significance really about that, because that season prior to Christmas is really a time of waiting, a time of reform, a time of renewal, a time of preparation. And that really helps us in our own Christian lives as people who are on the journey, people who understand that there's something beyond right now in this life. The other thing that I'd like us to talk about is his actual name. He chose John of the Cross. So that was significant for him, the cross of Christ. Not only sharing in that, but taking that on as his name. How do you think, and why do you think that would have been significant for him?
Well, and we have a few saints throughout times. There's Paul of the Cross. We have Edith Stein, Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. Particular saints who have really embraced that cross of Christ, recognizing that before we can come to the resurrection, we have to be part of the cross. We hear that in Paul himself. I preach Christ crucified. And so for John, it was really a badge of honor to be united with the Christ who died on the cross, the suffering, the anguish, but the redemption that comes through the cross. And that comes through in his writings. It comes through in really how he offered himself as a humble vehicle of bringing others to Christ. That we suffer and die, but then we rise in that light and life of Christ.
Well, in Advent season, we could remember him and celebrate his life on December 14th. And we encourage the folks that are with us, like all of the saints that we talk about, to learn more about them. Perhaps there's someone whose name is John who's watching, who might have a birthday very close to this feast of December 14th, and maybe take that on as their patron. Learn more about the saint, learn more about who they are, why they lived, how they express their faith, and to not only embody that, but also to share that. We're going to talk about another John in just a moment. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Light Moments. Here's Father Tom McSweeney.
Rita Churchilla moved to Millbrook, New York in 1989. At her regular job, she worked as a waitress. But on Saturdays, she sold homemade cookies, pies, and other treats at the local farmer's market. You see, Miss Churchilla loved to bake, and as it turned out, people loved eating her baked goods. And 3 years later, Rita Churchilla used her life savings to open a bakery. She didn't get much sleep until she could afford to hire some help, but the hard-working and gifted baker did get customers who were loyal enough to stand on long lines for her pastries. So here's a recipe you might want to try. You combine talent, love for your work, and a willingness to take a risk, and add to that years of hard work. And with a final dash of good luck, you too can create something delicious.
This message from the Christophers.
Whether it's passing on medicine, a blanket, or something as simple as a glass of water, that's how compassion works. And that's how Maryknoll works, hand to hand to hand. For nearly 100 years, Maryknoll's been passing on your help to the priests and brothers working in 26 countries around the world. Maryknoll, an American Catholic organization, dedicates 86 cents of every dollar donated to their programs, serving the world's poor and powerless. And that's how it works. Compassion flows from your hand to the hand of someone in need. Hand to hand to hand. That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's
Maryknoll. That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll. That's Maryknoll.
I spent 34 years as a teacher.
For the first 10 minutes of teaching, I was terrified. And then I fell in love with it.
I am so grateful that teaching was my ministry. It was such a gift.
Many sisters, brothers, and religious order priests served for little pay.
One year, I had a classroom of 68 children.
I was chaplain for the ice hockey team and loved it, even the 6:30 a.m. practices.
Today, hundreds of religious communities lack retirement funds.
I loved helping the kids stage musicals.
Gifts to the Retirement Fund for Religious help provide for medications, nursing care, and more.
Back then, we didn't earn much, but seeing a child learn was really priceless.
Please give to those who have given a lifetime. Donate at your local parish.
Thank you, and God bless you.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about our final John of the segment, and that is John of Capistrano. You know, when we say John of Capistrano, many people think of the missionary in California, San Juan Capistrano, which obviously is named after him. But let's talk a little bit about his life and maybe some of his contemporaries and some of his religious background.
Well, interestingly enough, he's born in 1386, which is just a few years before of John of Kanty. Of course, John of Kanty is born in Poland. John of Capistrano, not being from Poland, so they would not have known each other. But they're in the same time period. A time period of great growth in the faith, a great surgence in religious life. We know that John of Capistrano is a Franciscan. And so, again, we've talked in this series before about the charisms of different religious orders. We've talked about the Dominicans being the order of preachers. We see in the Franciscans, coming from Francis, that great sense of stripping oneself of wealth and of power and being more concerned with caring for the poor and the sick and the suffering. And so we know that that was really a hallmark of John's life, as it was for all Franciscans. We also know that it is a time of expansion of the faith. One of the sad times in the history of the church is not so much this desire to expand the faith, but how it was done. And so we know that there are crusades. We know that John was part of at least one crusade that we have well documented. At the age of 70, he's part of a crusade that defeats the Turks. So there was this great desire to continue to share the faith. We know that obviously he was very good in battle. He was very good and victorious in the Crusades. But however misguided the Crusades may have been, his heart's desire was to spread this message of peace in Christ Jesus.
When I think of John of Capistrano, oftentimes I think of someone like St. Paul, who was very well known to preach to crowds. And obviously Jesus preached to crowds. And John of Capistrano preached to crowds. You know, there's this whole sense that if there were people gathered around him to listen, he was going to preach the gospel to them. You know, and that's not always the lot of everybody or every saint. You know, sometimes we preach to very small crowds or one person. But this man had an opportunity to preach to great numbers of people at one time. And then when that phenomenon happens, normally those people listen to that and then carry on and preach that good news themselves. And so Christianity and evangelization is really kind of a domino effect. You know, I preach to this person takes that good news and preaches to another person. You know, we see that happening in the gospel. You know, when Andrew was a disciple of John the Baptist, and he went and told his brother Peter about finding Jesus. There's other great evangelists that he had heard. So there's this whole sense that, you know, they carry on the faith. They continue to preach the good news. And really, isn't that the lot of all Christians, is to carry on the faith, to preach not just to crowds, but to everybody and anybody?
Well, and how often, sometimes someone will tell me, oh, I wasn't able to make it to Mass this weekend, but I went to lunch with so-and-so, and they told me about the homily. And then I'll listen, I'm like, is that what I said? You know, but they're taking what they had heard and they're passing it on, and then someone else passes it on. So really, we are called to all model ourselves. One of the things I hope people are discovering in these series on the saints is that not that we're going to be exactly like any one particular, but that we are certainly to learn from their examples. So as we look at John of Capistrano, that opportunity to go forward and to preach, to go forward and to desire to spread the gospel message, to go forward and to be a person of charity, to recognize people in poverty and to lift them up, to see where we are now. We can't go back to 1386 when he was born, to the early 1400s, but in our current age, how do we take those charisms of his life and put it into practice in our own?
Which brings me to another thought, and that is that John of Capistrano was known as a soldier saint. And so when we look at many of the people in our armed forces who want to look up to somebody as a saint, they can certainly look to John of Capistrano. You know, the people who serve us well overseas or here in our own country or in bases throughout the world, to know that what they do is important for liberty, for freedom, for carrying on the tenets of what is right and what is good. And so maybe for them to turn to John of Capistrano during their maybe difficult times or difficult days or very down days, because being in the military is not always wonderful times. Anything else? We have a few minutes left of our show today that we'd like to mention about him. One thing that comes to mind is that he preached penance all the time. You know, sometimes that goes only so far, but we all need to hear that, don't we, from time to time?
Well, and I think over the history of the church, we've given the word penance to the sacrament of reconciliation or to forgiveness. And so one would hope that they're always linked. To not just dwell on what do you have to do to make up for your sins, but the fact that there is that forgiveness of those sins. And I think that's lacking in our world these days. It's not just the negative side of it, but we've really lost that sense of forgiveness or the need for reconciliation. No one's going to tell me I'm wrong, and I don't have to admit that I made a mistake, and you know, you're the one that's wrong, not me. And we're willing to, even if we admit it to ourselves, we're not going to let anyone else know. And so I think we do need to revisit this sense of the total package of reconciliation, that we do make mistakes. God is merciful. We do have to atone for what we do wrong, and we need to try to do better in the future. I think we'd be much better off if we could all invite that pattern into our lives.
And the church celebrates the feast of John of Capistrano on October 23rd, and we'd like to thank the folks that are with us. Thank you, and please pray for the saints and look to them for your example. And thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Their numbers are growing. More than a year ago, more than a decade ago, more people now living in this state than nearly any state in the Union. 1 out of every 10 families in America. 1 out of every 6 children in America. 33 million Americans teetering on the brink of hunger, sickness, hardship. 33 million Americans descending into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.